14 landed there in 1971, right above the Framora region, which is kind of like south of Copernicus, and it's right at the edge of that big Imbrium basin that I talked about. They brought back a lot of rocks. They were interested in the rocks that were excavated from Imbrium. So there's a lot of impact melt, as we call them, or breccias. And every time a rock gets exposed to like heat and pressure and started to remelt in like an impact event like that, it resets the internal clock. So when rocks form, they record the condition from which they formed, including the age, like the time when they formed. But every time there's an impact event and it gets remelted, that internal clock resets. Now we can take these rocks and then measure the ages of them. And so every time the clock got reset, we now have the age of that impact event. And so we want to know when Imbrium formed, because it's such a big event that happened on the moon, that we can put everything else in relative age to each other. So that why that mission was important. Apollo 12 landed in the Oceanus Procellarum region, which is sort of to the lower left and then going up. It's kind of like where that shaded, like where you kind of stop seeing the moon, you know, the boundary of the shade and the sunlight lit area. The little bright spot that comes up on the, what is that, lower left third of the moon, that is Aristarchus crater. So that's a super bright crater in that Procellarum region, which we're now seeing more and more of. So that's sort of the area where Apollo 12 landed. That landing was to sort of show that we can do a pinpoint landing. So they landed 200 meters away from the Surveyor 3 lander, and they actually brought a piece from Surveyor 3 back to Earth to like really show. And that then paved the way for future missions to like really like, hey, we can do a pinpoint landing. So we can go to like a more difficult terrain where we can land, where it's more ruggedy. And so that's where we went there. And so now you can see even more of the Procellarum region. Most of that is dark gray, as you can see, and so these are the basalts, and that mission brought back a lot of these basaltic materials. And then we can look at the ages, and it turns out that those basalts were very different, and they were younger than the Apollo 11 mission, than the rocks that they brought back, the basalts that they brought back. Now, Artemis is going to be super exciting because we're going to a very different region. So if you look at the surface here, and you can see that's mostly dark gray, so it's mostly basalts. You can see in the upper part of the moon that's still bright. That's what we call the highland crust. So that's the very old crust. So when the moon formed, there was a giant impact between two protoplanets. It collided, created a lot of heat, everything melted. The center part formed and became Earth. And then the debris cloud that surrounded it coalesced and then became the moon. So once upon a time, the moon was covered in a global magma ocean. So it was fully molten, right? And if you have a global magma ocean, you start crystallizing things. So now when you crystallize stuff that is denser than the melt, that sinks, right? And if you crystallize things that are less dense than the melt, that starts to float, like ice is floating on water, right? And so now we have these crystals crystallizing these minerals, and they are less dense, so they float to the surface and they build the crust. These crystals are called plagioclase. They're white. And so your crust that then forms on the moon is white. And that's why the moon looks so bright when you look at this image or in the night sky, because that's the old crust of, you know, the oldest rocks we have, and they're white in color. And so that's why this is so bright. Now the near side, so the side that we see right now, we see these dark patches, which then are the younger basalts that came to the surface once you start impacting it, and you take stuff away, you made these big basins, and then the interior remelts, and that melt comes up to form to fill these craters. That's very special. So it turns out that this Procellarum region, where Imbrium sits in, where Apollo 12 landed, where Apollo 14 landed, all these rocks that were brought back, they have a weird component that we call creep. And it's spelled K-R-E-E-P, and it stands for potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphor. That entire Mars region that you can see here is also has iron in it, lots of iron and lots of titanium, but the rest of the moon doesn't really have that. And so geologically speaking, all the Apollo rocks are really, really cool because they're very special, right? So if I would give you 6 missions and you land them on Earth and you land them all in Yellowstone National Park, and you collect all your rocks, right, you get, geologically speaking, really interesting rocks, but they're not representative for the United States or the rest of the world, right? So same happens with Apollo. Really cool rocks, geologically speaking, very interesting, lots of basalts, right? They all have this weird crib component, so they're all creepy. But the rest of the moon is very different, so they're not representative. Now with Artemis, we're going to go to the South Polar region. So that region is more representative compared to Apollo. We don't really expect a lot of basalts there, so that's more like highland region. The South Polar region also has the largest impact basin that we have on the moon, and also the oldest. So if we can bring back rocks from there, we can hopefully date that really, really old impact region, and then get a better idea of when things happened on the moon and establish a timeline. Now we also know that the polar regions are really, really cold. And so ices or volatiles and gases on the moon, they freeze out in the polar region. So when we go there and collect rocks, we can also bring back these frozen samples and then learn something about where the water is coming from, whether it's moon or, there was lots of asteroids and comets that impacted the moon. And then so we can also learn about something about the water that was delivered to the Earth-Moon system, which most likely also ended up on Earth. And so we can learn something about our own history and how the moon formed and evolved over time better than we can with Apollo. We're missing a lot of rocks and processes with Apollo, and hopefully we can fill these gaps with Artemis.
You are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information. Now, as we continue to get closer and closer to the lunar surface, of course, these features are going to become more and more clear. Orion is now 2,000 miles away from the moon, but at closest approach today, it will be just about 80 miles above the lunar surface. So before you go for the day, it looks like we are starting to get some better views of that area that you were discussing before. Is there any other items or areas that have come into view since we've been chit-chatting that you think would be helpful to point out?
Yeah, so we see Kepler crater, which is sort of to the left and lower left of Copernicus, what I just pointed out. So it's this like grayish area with the little dot in the center. And then if you go from there further to the left, right at where the moon's shades are, so there's still a little lower left, that really bright area, that's Aristarchus crater. And that's a really young crater, and it's really bright because it brought up material from that crust that I saw, and that's this white rock. It turns out we have orbital reflectance data. So when we look at the light, the sunlight that gets reflected off the surface, we can make assumptions about the chemistry in that region. And it turns out that that region is, geologically speaking, really, really complicated. So it brought back up old crustal material, but we also see some basaltic material. And in the central peak, we see material that is silicic, so it's really, really high in silica. And that usually means there's some kind of evolved rock. And when we say evolved, on Earth, that usually means like granites and stuff like that. We don't really mean it that way here, but it has more silica content in it. When I say central peak, so what happens when you have a big impact into the crust rebounds and brings a central part comes up. If you think about it, throwing a rock into water, right, it makes a splash, and then the water rebounds and brings a kind of like a central thing up and then plops back down. So if you would freeze that water, it would stand up in the center. So that happens on the moon or on Earth as well, where like the crust rebounds. And so the central peak is the area that is the deepest material that got brought back to the surface. So that is of importance and special interest to scientists, because now we have another window into the interior of the moon to study these things. And it turns out, specifically for that little bright crater there, it's super complicated, and then we're still trying to figure out what we're seeing.
So it sounds like there's definitely much to be learned from the moon, especially through the Artemis program, and I'm sure you're looking forward to getting some of those samples back to be able to study in depth.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Juliana, for taking time out of your day to chat with us. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is fantastic.
We're now 50 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. This burn will slingshot Orion around the lunar surface and put it in a trajectory ahead of a splashdown on December 11th back on Earth. This burn will be a 3-minute and 27-second long burn and will be the longest burn of the mission utilizing the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. You are getting a view of the OMS engine on your screen. It's in the very top left, the largest engine on your screen. The next major milestone that we're tracking here in Mission Control Houston is the Go, No-Go poll. During this poll, NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling will go around the room and poll each of the flight console positions to ensure that all is looking good ahead of today's burn. Orion is now less than 2,000 miles away from the moon, 1,756 miles, moving at a velocity of 4,563 miles per hour. At this time, Orion is over 237,000 miles away from Earth. Orion continuing to close in on the moon, now 1,100 miles above the surface of the moon. During today's closest approach, Orion will be just 80 miles above the surface of the moon. Here in just a couple of minutes, we do expect NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling to give a go, no-go poll for today's return-powered flyby burn. If the team polls go, then we are anticipating the burn to begin at 10:43 a.m. Central and last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. This burn will slingshot us around the moon and get Orion into a trajectory to return back to Earth and splash down off the coast of California. While Orion is behind the moon today, we will not have communication with the vehicle because the moon will be blocking the connection to the deep space network. However, once Orion swings back around on the other side of the moon and regains communications with the deep space network, we do anticipate to be able to communicate with the vehicle. Today's loss of signal is slated to last 30 minutes. And at this time period, we are now 29 minutes away from the loss of signal and about an hour away from the acquisition of signal. And here is the view of the moon, as mentioned, less than 1,000 miles away. Still a little ways to go to get to our closest approach of the day, at which point Orion will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. But we are getting closer to today's anticipated burn, now 27 minutes away from that burn, and just 24 minutes away from the anticipated loss of signal. Orion continuing to pick up speed as it closes in on the lunar surface, now traveling at 4,852 miles per hour, and now just 846 miles away from the moon. We're continuing to get a shot of the Orion spacecraft, namely the European Service Module and the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, on the left hand of your screen there, the largest engine shown. That's actually the largest engine on the Orion spacecraft. The OMS engine is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown on 19 Space Shuttle flights. The first flight was STS-41G in October 1984, and the last was STS-112 in October 2002. And the go, no-go poll for the return powered flyby is now underway. And the team here in Mission Control Houston did poll go for today's return powered flyby burn. That burn will take place 23 minutes from now. And with the go from the team here in Mission Control Houston for the return powered flyby burn, we're now just counting down the minutes until the start of that burn. Again, 22 minutes away from today's burn. This burn will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. But just prior to the burn, we will lose signal with the Orion spacecraft. That loss of signal is anticipated in 19 minutes from now. The reason we do lose communication with the spacecraft is because it will be flying directly behind the moon, and the moon is blocking the signal to the deep space network. However, once the spacecraft travels back to the other side of the moon, we do expect to regain communications with the vehicle at that time. Orion is now only 687 miles away from the moon. At closest approach today, Orion will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. Now just 20 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby. This burn will commit Orion to a trajectory to head back to planet Earth after its 20-day mission so far. By the time Orion splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, it will have been in space for 25.5 days. And we're continuing to get some great views of the lunar surface as we fly just 500 miles overhead. This view coming from one of the solar array wings or SAW cameras as it gets into the proper position for today's burn. Coincidentally, 8 years ago to the day was the launch of the Exploration Flight Test 1, or EFT-1. This was the first test flight of the crew module portion of the Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle. This was an uncrewed test flight that orbited the Earth 2 times before splashing down. Now, 8 years later, Orion is about to fly behind the moon. We're 15 minutes away from today's burn. We're now 13 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. Orion is 365 miles above the lunar surface, traveling at a speed of 4,963 miles per hour. Just 10 minutes from now, we do anticipate losing signal with Orion as it begins its trip around the backside of the moon. On the bottom of your screen in the left there, you can see the solar array as it begins to move into place. You're also looking at the Orion capsule itself there, taking up the majority of your screen. You can see the kind of silver coloring of the capsule. This is the portion that when we have a crew on board as part of Artemis 2 that they will be living and working in during their trip to the moon and beyond. And in the top left of your screen there, you can see the moon as Orion glides over it, again 335 miles above the surface. But at the closest approach during today's return-powered flyby burn, Orion will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. We are hearing that the solar arrays are configured for today's burn. Orion is now moving to the proper burn attitude. We're now 10 minutes and 30 seconds away from the start of today's 3-minute and 27-second burn. And we expect to lose signal with Orion in 8 minutes. Today's return-powered flyby burn sets us up on a trajectory to splash down off the coast of California just a few days from now on December 11th. And you were seeing some thruster firings there as Orion maneuvers to the proper attitude for today's burn. Now less than 6 minutes, 30 seconds until we lose signal with Orion. The burn will start in 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Orion is currently 253 miles above the lunar surface. Today's 3-minute and 27-second burn will take place with the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. That's the largest engine on the European Service Module. Today's burn will change the velocity of the spacecraft by 960 feet per second during its 3-minute, 27-second burn. Closing in on 5 minutes away from our anticipated loss of signal with Orion. We will not have signal with Orion because the moon will be blocking out the signal to the Deep Space Network. However, when we swing back around on the other side of the moon, we do anticipate to regain those communications. On your screen of the lunar surface as well as Earth, For Orion, this is not a goodbye, but a see you later to the moon, our nearest celestial neighbor, as we begin to get our first glimpse of an Earthrise coming into frame. In this view, we see 8 billion human lives all existing upon our pale blue dot, our blue marble, our very own spaceship Earth. And after a long journey, Orion is now coming home. From this view, Orion is 1,277 miles above the lunar surface following its return-powered flyby burn, which sent it around the backside of the moon. Orion now has its sights set on home. Orion will splash down off the coast of California on December 11th. Wrapping up a 25-and-a-half-day mission. The next time we see such a view, we will be hearing about it from a crew's perspective during Artemis II. Continuing to hear good performance following today's return-powered flyby burn. The Orion spacecraft is continuing to distance itself from the moon, now over 1,500 miles away from the lunar surface. Throughout the course of the next few days, we will see the distance from Earth continue to grow smaller and smaller. Orion is now 242,000 miles away from planet Earth. The spacecraft is moving at a velocity of 2,150 miles per hour. We're continuing to get some spectacular views from the Orion spacecraft. This view is from one of the solar array wing or SAW cameras on board the vehicle. The vehicle now over 1,680 miles away from the moon. And that small sliver towards the bottom of your screen, that's here, that's home, that's us. And that is where Orion is headed next.